Welcome, everyone. I'm Penny Lewis, the Ecological Landscape Alliance Executive Director, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar, Capturing Carbon with Trees. This is part of the Focus on Sustainability webinar series, a series that was developed by a group of organizations known regionally for their quality ecological education. By collaborating on these webinars, we expand the reach of our regional programs. In case you're not familiar with our organizations, they are largely nonprofit and volunteer groups in the United States. The regional groups are the Ecological Landscape Alliance, the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council, the Sustainability Division of the Illinois Landscape Contractors Association, the Kansas City Native Plant Initiative, and Rescape California. And now I would like to introduce our presenter, Christopher Woodall. Dr. Woodall is the project leader of the U.S. Forest Service's Center for Research on Ecosystem Change. Along with partnering organizations, the center gathers data in order to develop tools and techniques to better maintain forests in the northern region of the United States. Dr. Woodall has worked on various national and regional forest inventory programs and has been involved with research and coordination activities for the U.S. Forest Service and other federal agencies. Welcome, Dr. Woodall.
Hi there, thanks. So the presentation today is about forest carbon accounting in the United States, and I'd like to give you a little bit of background about how we measure forest carbon and some of the trajectories we could expect in the future in regards to forest sequestration, and then just talk a little bit about drilling down into the details associated with forest carbon accounting and some regional results and maybe what you might experience or think about even at the scale of a stand, a group of trees. So my outline for my talk is to give you a little bit of background about why we inventory forest carbon and some of the context for the reporting standards internationally and nationally, and how we do it specifically in the United States. Then show you some of the results, and like I said, some of the directions we might expect forest carbon to head in the future. And then, like I said, talk about downscaling a bit as far as your particular situations and what you might need to think about when it comes to forest carbon in any particular forest. So for some of the background, why do we inventory forest carbon? I have two numbers here, 86% and about 12%. And for 86%, that relates to the amount of sequestration by land use across the United States. Whether we're talking about settlements like cities, suburban areas, grasslands, croplands, or agricultural areas, and then forest land. These are various land uses. So the annual sequestration of those terrestrial land uses, forest land by far accounts for most of the sequestration, about 86% annually. Something like settlements, I know a lot of urban foresters now planting a lot more trees, so we are seeing sequestration in urban areas at times. This figure does not account for fossil fuel burning or anything else that you might have in these land uses. Just looking right now at what plants might be sequestering carbon. The 12% refers to the amount of forest sequestration that offsets annual greenhouse gas emissions. So the burning of coal, fossil fuels annually, the growth of forests offsets about 12% of that. Given the amount that the U.S. burns as far as fossil fuels, that's quite a large amount of carbon. So there's tremendous policy implications if our forests are no longer able to sequester carbon in the future. That would happen from the decline of forests, so reductions in growth, in concert potentially with loss of forest land, so the amount of forest land use area. So those are two important numbers to kind of keep in your minds when we talk about forests and carbon. Why is carbon important? A lot of you already know this. Really, it is a metric of forest and society these days. I say society because it really is the burning of fossil fuels. You know, carbon stored long ago through the growth of vegetation millennia ago. And certainly it's a metric of forest. living forest. Carbon sequestration is part of how the ecosystem functions, as the storing of carbohydrates, fixed from the photosynthesis. So here I have a figure showing what people were really thinking about a couple years ago when it came to the Paris meeting of parties that signed on to the UNFCCC. So those nations interested in climate change and carbon sequestration. And the green line at the bottom of this figure is the annual sequestration of forests mainly. So you see a negative number, so carbon coming out of the atmosphere, and then the black line is carbon emissions, like I said, fossil fuel burning, etc. So forests play a strong role in where our climate is headed as far as CO2 emissions, etc. So there's a lot of interest in reducing the uncertainty associated with that green line so we can have more confidence in our trajectories of carbon emissions. Certainly, like I said, the attributes of forest ecosystems, so carbon sequestration, is really kind of on par with fossil fuel emissions when considering future trajectories. And some people have said, certainly, that the future condition of forests is really a trillion-dollar question, because if forests can't sequester carbon in the future, or if we lose forests, it'll put even more focus on our fossil fuel burning and alternative energy sources, etc. Certainly, those policy issues have real-world implications as far as what we might expect as far as future global warming and other global change situations. The major kind of hurdle when it comes to accounting for forest carbon is really the diversity of forests. There's various pools. So a pool is really defined as kind of a forest ecosystem component that can be kind of generally defined as as a certain kind of process. You have your above ground biomass, that's your growing trees and shrubs and other vegetation. You have your below ground biomass, which you can't really see, but certainly, as you know, supports that above ground biomass. It has to be measured in a different way. Then you have your dead wood components, both down dead and standing dead trees. You have your litter layer, which is really the kind of leaf fall and small branches that accumulate on the surface of the soil. Then you have your soil organic carbon, which really can represent at times millennia of carbon being kind of emitted and leached and decomposed into the soil layer. So very complex systems. That's why there's a lot of carbon in forests, especially in the U.S., given this kind of array of carbon pools. You would expect that it is much more simpler in agricultural systems where we're really just concerned about soil organic carbon. In forests, it's a much more complex system. And in the U.S., not only is a lot of diverse forest carbon pools and diversity of forest ecosystems, but it's we have a large nation with a diversity of forest ecosystems. Whether you're talking about the Pacific Northwest, the coastal plains of the Southeast, the aspen forest, the Lake States, ponderosa pine forest, the Rocky Mountains, sugar maple forest of New England, I could go on, right? So there's a great diversity of forests across the U.S. and a long history of changing land use, which can really impact pools such as soil carbon. This map shows the type of carbon pool that represents the plurality of carbon for an individual site. So for the coastal areas and high latitude areas, the soil organic carbon has the most carbon in a forest ecosystem. So you can see the coastal plain of South Carolina. That's where most of the carbon is not in the trees, but it's actually in the soil. That's in contrast to Appalachian Mountains, where most of the carbon is actually in the live biomass, and definitely the Pacific Northwest, where you have tremendous stores of carbon in live biomass. Areas of the Rocky Mountains where they might have had recent mortality, it's really these dry, montane systems. Most of the carbon is in the dead wood or forest floor. So a dynamic of processes that account for carbon across the United States. So a little bit into how do we account for carbon, who's counting it, forest carbon across the United States. The U.S. Forest Service is largely responsible for the forest portion of the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. That's been the case for a number of decades. Other agencies, such as the Department of Energy, is responsible for accounting for fossil fuel burning, etc. So every year, we report on our carbon across the U.S., both emissions and sequestration, to the United Nations. They had a conference way back in the 90s, a conference on climate change. So you see the UNFCCC really refers, that's an acronym that refers to the first convention on climate change, where a number of nations, such as the U.S., signed on to report their carbon annually. It doesn't necessarily mean we manage the carbon, it just means we agree to report on carbon. Just a couple slides on background. I don't like to use a lot of text, but excuse me for laying out some basics here. So as I mentioned, that's the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that we report to. The major sector I'm talking about is the land use and forestry sector. And we have to report on our forest area and the changes in carbon stocks every year back to 1990. So for this year, the report would be 1990 through 2018. A major hurdle for getting back to 1990 is that we didn't have a lot of modern kind of remote sensing and forest inventories back in 1990. In fact, in the United States, the U.S., we only comprehensively inventoried forests in 2 states in 1990, whereas right now we're inventorying all 50 every year. So it's pretty hard to get back to 1990, but we're fairly confident about our estimates here in the contemporary age. So as I mentioned, we compile these estimates annually. We submit them to the United Nations. This reporting is coordinated by the Environmental Protection Agency. And there's reporting guidelines which are set up by the IPCC. And as I mentioned, there's emissions and sinks. And sink is basically sequestration. It's another term for that. People call it a sink because roughly that's where you gather water. That's where you gather, in layman's terms, that's where you gather carbon. So that also means sequestration. As I mentioned, forestry is one among many sectors such as energy and industrial processes or waste management, etc. So talk a little bit more about forest carbon and how we account for that. We have a national inventory of forests. You see a map right there showing you a forest inventory plots by region across the United States. At each one of those plots, I'll get into this more detail, but at each of those locations, we have a plot where we measure various forest attributes. There's a picture of that there. So we estimate carbon change by measuring those plots across time. So the plot, we estimate carbon at time 1, and we then measure it again at time 2 and estimate carbon at time 2. So that's really called the stock change difference, is our accounting approach to measuring carbon across the U.S. And as we tactically deploy the inventory by state, we can summarize the inventory by each state then, and then roll it up to the national level. And that's been the process now for about 20 years for doing the forest carbon inventory, with many refinements, which I'll get into, but that's the basic approach. Like I said, we don't measure the flux of each individual piece of wood in forests. Technically, that's the most scientific way to do it. If you really want to study it in detail, you'd attach a gas exchange chamber to each tree, each piece of wood, and track it over time. So that is done in really detailed studies at an individual research plot level. But across the United States, obviously we can't do that. So it's measuring trees, such as their diameter, height, and using models to estimate their carbon, which I'll get into more detail here. But certainly at a plot in time 1, if you had more carbon in 2005 here, and you subtract to this pictorial representation, subtract time 2, less carbon, that would equal an emission for that particular plot. And it could be scaled up to the population level. As I mentioned, our forest carbon accounting techniques have hopefully improved over time. And this is just a trajectory of back in 1990, we had really periodic and inconsistent forest inventories. 2000, Congress passed a Farm Bill authorizing annual inventory, which started around 2000, and now we have a nationally consistent annual inventory. And really since 2000, we've been using that data to refine our modeling approaches. In other words, we measure diameter of a tree and try to turn that into biomass. So the models we use, we have been refining those, along with better incorporation of down dead information, soils information, forest floor information from all these plots where we are now measuring across the U.S. So our improvement paradigm, there's a statement from the United Nations IPCC that every nation should try to not have biased results, neither over nor underestimate their nation's forest carbon. And you should try to reduce those uncertainties as far as is practical. So that means in the U.S. we've been trying to use more and more of the annual inventory we started around 2000. Also incorporate auxiliary information. And that really, in this day and age, means satellite information, means laser scanning technologies. And we're doing a lot of research on that. We want to align our national and international reporting instruments. So we don't have one report in the U.S. saying there's X amount of forest carbon and another report saying stating a different number. We need to have transparency and open access. So we give a number of talks and webinars such as this to relay where we stand with our carbon accounting. Certainly, as I mentioned, with laser scanning, we need to incorporate emergent science and of course, build partnerships with state and other federal agencies, local communities, so people understand what we're doing. Trying to remain nimble is difficult, and certainly emerging issues such as wildfires, etc., hurricane damage. People want to know the implications and effects of global change phenomena, invasive species, climate change phenomena such as stronger storms on forest carbon across the U.S. A little bit of background on how we do the inventory a little bit more specifically. So it's almost like a three-phase inventory. The first phase, we use remotely sensed imagery to identify what's forest and non-forest. Certainly, we don't want to send a forest inventory crew to a cornfield, as there are no trees there. Once we have that imagery, we overlay these interpenetrating panels. And we have a zoom in here to show you what they look like. And we sample, we put up one plot in each of those panels. And if that plot falls in a forest, or we think it's even close to falling in a forest, we send a field crew to go measure it. And we measure about 10 to 20% of those plots a year. And assuming a 20% per year inventory, we've colored these hexagonal panels here to represent how many you would measure in any particular year. So they're equally dispersed across the landscape. And it is approximately one plot for every 6,000 acres across the U.S. So with that plot design, you can imagine one of those plots is really 4 subplots. And on the subplots, we measure the standing, live, and dead trees. On these smaller microplots, which are about 6.8 feet in radius, we measure the saplings, and so that's trees less than 5 inches, and do a seedling count. And we also do soil sampling down woody debris or dead wood, down dead wood sampling on transects on those plots. Plus have understory vegetation like shrubs and grasses that we measure on those red quadrats, as it were. There's variation. This is the national core design. If in some areas there's interest to do additional sampling, if the state or other agencies are paying for that cost, then we expand the sampling. So Pacific Northwest, they do lichen sampling, et cetera. So there's opportunities, and you see it on this slide, for additional sampling to occur. But I'm mainly talking about the national core design. For our inventory, certainly we want to use all inventory plots. So this upper left map shows our forest plots. There's so many plots. There's a couple 100,000 plots. It looks like one green blob, but those are individual plots. We also have non-forest plots that are obviously in agricultural developed areas or in what would be kind of grassland type situations. And there you see Wyoming. That was the last state to get an annual inventory going. So this map is already a couple years old, and inventory in Wyoming now is roughly all set up. So that would be almost fully covered in by now. So I talked about field measurements versus models. We do a lot of modeling research to improve our estimates. Certainly with a live tree, you wrap a diameter tape around it, get its height, its species, and that can really help you estimate the biomass and carbon in it. But you're still kind of modeling a bit because you're not actually cutting the tree down and doing water displacement to find out its actual volume and wood chemistry analysis for its actual specific gravity, et cetera. So we have assumptions and models to turn that measurement into an estimate of carbon. Staining dead tree, there's even more uncertainty about that because of rot and decay and missing limbs and et cetera. So litter, once again, we do measure it, but there's a lot of modeling and assumptions that have to be assumed. Same for down dead wood. We have recent papers on these topics of modeling litter and soil organic carbon, that's SOC. There's a lot of assumptions, certainly with soil carbon, but we've conducted measurements on 5,000 plots across the U.S. of forest soil carbon, are feeling pretty good with the data set that we have. And below ground is a major modeling effort. A lot of assumptions on the relationships between root-shoot ratios by climate regions across the U.S. So we have some research on that too. Basically, I have this figure there. It's really kind of trying to take a tree and conceptualize it as a geometric form. This is an oversimplification, but that's what modeling is trying to do in many of these situations. As I mentioned, in some situations, like this picture to the right, it might be fairly straightforward in turning that bowl into an estimate of carbon. There might not be a lot of uncertainty about that. But a lot of tree forms across the U.S., like this picture to the left, that's a challenging proposition to turn a measurement of diameter and height into a highly certain estimate of carbon. But the process usually follows applying a volume equation and turning that into a estimate of biomass based on the species, basically the bulk density or specific gravity of that wood, and then an estimate of carbon. And we roughly delineate that by angiosperms and gymnosperms, so conifers versus hardwoods, as it were. So that's how we estimate the kind of carbon density of the trees. There's many sources of error, and I haven't talked about error that much, besides just saying uncertainty. We have sampling error, which is fairly low. We report on that across the U.S. At a state level for like entire biomass in any given state, the sampling error is probably less than 1%. There's measurement error, which is more appreciable as we drill down into the various carbon pools, such as soil carbon and litter layer. But that we have various quality control procedures and scoring techniques for our field crew to make sure that they're adhering to measurement protocols. Their promotion potential is actually gauged on their remeasurement, repeatability. So they're blind checked in the field. As I mentioned, there's model uncertainty, and regarding the model you select for any kind of carbon estimation, that can actually increase uncertainty. So those are relatively kind of the three sources of error that we talk about when it comes to forest carbon accounting. Those translate into total uncertainty. And something like I said, staining live tree pool probably has less uncertainty associated with our estimates of carbon because we have those field-based measurements of diameter and height, very well-established estimators for turning those into population estimates, and fairly good quality control on those because they're live trees. The deadwood pool, much harder. In the past, we estimated carbon based on just anecdotal studies. A researcher might have studied a couple forest types here and there, and we had to develop a model. And those models can be insensitive to climate change events. So right now we're really looking at better ways to apply our inventory of deadwood, where we're measuring their diameters and species along transects in our national inventory of carbon. And so, as I mentioned previously in this talk, that's a research direction we're really strongly headed in. Talk about trajectories a little bit. So we've gone over how we estimate carbon, get into some of the results, which is certainly more of interest. I tend to be certainly interested in our techniques and science associated with that, but the public's often interested in the results. So this is a figure. There's a lot of guesswork, I would assume, going back in the 1700s, but based on land records, et cetera, and what we know about forest resources in the U.S., scientists have estimated our carbon kind of status of forest across time. So the positive number is emission of carbon to the atmosphere. So, and the negative number is sequestration. That's kind of a common terminology, and you saw it in an earlier figure when it comes to forest carbon. So with land settlement and clearing of land for agriculture and in the Industrial Revolution in the U.S., up through the early 1900s, there's a lot of loss of forests, a lot of conversion of forest, obviously, and a lot of the mature forests in the U.S. really, if they remained forests, were at an earlier stand age, certainly, as they were harvested a lot. So a lot of emission of carbon to the atmosphere, a lot. And really around the early 1900s, as industrial agriculture took off and family farms kind of closed up and people kind of migrated to urban areas and suburban areas, we had an increase in forest land. Really, since the early 1900s, forest land has increased every year sequentially across the U.S. And we know this from our forest inventory. And that really kind of peaked out, we believe, kind of in the late 1900s, 1990s or so. And we've had fairly stable accretion of additional forest land and stable forest growth since then. So we're still sequestering carbon right now. And there's a question as to how much more carbon could be sequestered. If you go with afforestation policies and really try to increase forest area and have maybe a vibrant forest products market coupled with allowing a lot of wilderness areas to accrue carbon without major disturbances such as wildfire, you can probably certainly sequester more forest carbon. That's really a policy and science question these days, and I certainly don't have all the answers on that. But this red arrow kind of points to what the potential could be, though. Looking at distribution of one of the major pools, live tree biomass and carbon across the U.S. by county, you certainly see that its preponderance of it is located on the coast of the U.S. Certainly the west coast into the northern Rockies, and then you have central hardwoods through the southern Appalachia, all the way up into New England. And certainly components of the lake states. So that's where a lot of the above live tree biomass is accumulating. Looking at the diversity of forest carbon pools, national estimates, so this is national carbon in forest, not surprisingly, but to surprise some, soil organic matter accounts for the largest amount of of forest carbon across pools. Runner-up is above ground biomass. And then in third place is the litter layer, followed, certainly in a close tie between deadwood and below ground biomass. So it's kind of maybe surprising to think that all the roots across the U.S. Of trees and forests is roughly equivalent to all the dead wood on the ground in forests. So, looking at global change events, above ground biomass and soil carbon are large preponderance of forest carbon. We assume that soils don't change that rapidly. Certainly if there's warming and wetting events that continue on in the future, longer growing seasons, etc., that might cause more soil carbon to be emitted. That's a research question. Certainly if you convert a forest to an agricultural area, you're going to have probably continued carbon emissions from those soils into the future. So Looking at ownership, because a lot of the U.S. Forest Service land is more mature forest, putting on a lot of increment and has a lot of carbon in it. So it's about a quarter of all U.S. forest carbon is in the domain of the U.S. Forest Service. Although the vast majority, 58% of forest carbon is in private ownership. That's where policies, et cetera, and the future of family forests, industrial forests across the U.S. is really important when it comes to the future trajectories of forest carbon. And other publics certainly can refer to county and state forest, which there certainly is a lot of in the U.S. Looking at carbon flux, it is, we've summarized it by county. This figure is already a few years old, but kind of represents some interesting take-home points. Most counties are showing carbon sequestration. And for a number of counties where you might be showing emissions at times, like you see one in like Eastern California or Southwestern Wyoming, areas like that, or even areas in the Plain States, there's a lot of uncertainty. We might only have one forest plot in that one county because it's very sparsely forested. And if one tree happened to die on that plot, or there's a blowdown event, or it might have been converted to ag land, then it'll represent maybe, it'll show up as maybe an emission for that entire county. So uncertainties have to be kind of couched with this. But kind of shows over time, a lot of counties are kind of stable state, barely sequestering or barely emitting. So we do look at land use change because, as I said, that's an important driver of forest carbon. That's why the United Nations requires us to report on land use change. Think about it, in some nations, so they're having vast deforestation. We're not really experiencing that in the U.S., but that's why it's an important metric, looking at land use change. You can't start sequestering forest carbon if you're losing forest, net loss of forest annually. So the figure to the left is change in forest by these kind of hexagons across the U.S., and roughly we're accruing forest. Some counties certainly, or not counties, sorry, these hexagons, we are potentially losing forest, but we have a net accretion of forest. Where's that coming from? Where you see in the middle here, the change in agriculture. We've been losing agricultural land across the U.S. Some of that has been going to forest. But also we've been having an increase in developed areas, settlements, cities, ex-urban areas, and that has also been receiving some of the agricultural land, certainly. That's been the transfer. We created a kind of confusion matrix here of where all that carbon's flowing. And we're not going to drill into details, but so you can appreciate the complexity of this. You have forests that they have carbon that remains in forest across time, and that's kind of showing a transfer from stocks in time one, the left side of this figure, to the right side of this figure. And we have transfers of live tree carbon to the forest areas through development. You have loss also in deforestation to agriculture. But really the largest movement of carbon has been from afforestation. So agricultural areas, the soil carbon in agricultural areas being transferred back to forest at time two. That's been the largest transfer. If that dynamic changes and agricultural areas start to kind of increase, et cetera, then you can see that this dynamic would change and the carbon stocks at time two could decrease. So that's why I said this is a tremendous, has tremendous policy implications as far as tracking this and the science associated with accurately estimating these carbon pools. So we've been working on trying to better disentangle land use change from our change in forest resources over time in terms of forest carbon. So we have some documentation on this, which you can delve into, has a lot of details, which I can't get into. It's a technical document, but certainly it's publicly available. You can just Google this title and read up on all the literature and how we come to these kind of estimates. But we try to make approximations of land use change by region of the U.S. And it's a starting point, and we have a lot of assumptions right now as we build out the model. But you'll see 2 lines for each region of the U.S. Forest, remaining forest is carbon. That's remained in the forest. And then land use transfer. So that's carbon coming in from other land uses to forest. As I said, in the U.S., that's typically agricultural areas becoming forest once again. So in the north, we've had forest growing. So you have forest, remaining forest, accruing carbon. And we've had a lot of land use transfer. That's where we've probably had the most amount of agricultural land transferring into forest. In the south, it's a differing dynamic, and that's where we've had accruing carbon in forest, that solid line. You see a little dip after 2010. Sorry, from 2009 up to 2012, you see an increase in carbon. That's due to the global recession and the drop in harvesting. I do not have the harvested wood products carbon accounting. We do account for that. That's a separate kind of separate talk. But if there's a lot of harvesting, there is also long-lived forest long-lived forest products that accrue carbon, which is another important part of the story. So, but this type of approach allows us to disentangle those 2 important dynamics. You see for the Pacific Coast and Rocky Mountain, there's some solid lines there. We're still kind of trying to figure out what the baseline should be for these regions. But we set up the framework for accounting, and you saw the prior slide referred to this as a new framework for accounting. So we can combine all these together to look nationally at trends. And you see in the top figure here, land use change with a lot of assumptions into it. We're still assuming some land use transfer of carbon, such as from agricultural areas, and some still stable state growth of forest, so net forest sequestration. So that's the green line. Using this approach, we can disentangle disturbances and their effects on carbon. So you can see eastern versus western United States, and the total forest, remaining forest carbon, which is the center figure, and seeing how much growth versus cutting and fire in regions of the U.S. And land use change affect the total carbon budget. And as I mentioned, in the eastern U.S., there's a lot of cutting. We don't have the harvest wood products associated with it, so some of that cutting, or maybe a majority of it, goes into forest products. Hopefully long-lived ones that can offset emissions. But certainly there's a lot of growth, over 218 teragrams of carbon per year, which more than offsets cutting. And certainly out west, there's a lot of wildfires, but still the growth out west in the forest far offsets losses due to wildfire. But that's why there's serious concerns about droughts in the future and wildfires, because you don't want the growth to be negatively affected and wildfire to grow, because that could affect your carbon balance. The future scenarios. So you see kind of here the figure from you saw earlier in the talk about emissions, historic annual carbon flux, and in the background you see forest area, which is green. So you've seen forest area was reduced over time. That resulted in the increase in emissions. And with a stable state forest and a slightly accruing amount, we've been able to sequester carbon finally. And we have a little green figure there that shows you just across this long time span. It's just a little, there's a lot of uncertainty there, but we're having sequestration right now. Well, where might that head in the future? So these are trajectories using various scenarios of land use change and forest growth and forest harvesting, the economy in the future. And regardless of various scenarios, and the A2 versus B2 is climate change scenarios. Basically, we're looking at maybe net emissions within 20 to 30 years. So not accruing more forest and potential forest growth and disturbances resulting in net emissions for forests. So certainly there's a lot of guesswork with this. This is just looking at like assumptions that we assume today about trajectories of land use, but it can certainly give pause to thought about our current policies today, looking at these trajectories of forest carbon. So I've been talking about the national context, and I'd like to take the remainder of my talk to kind of drill down a little bit and talk about how your situation may differ. I know unlike how I have operated in the past at the national scale, most of you probably operate at the local scale. So just to say at the national context, really U.S. forests, certainly in the eastern U.S., but certainly, you know, in components of the West, is still recovering from past land use dynamics. And certainly that can really mean complex local dynamics. Any given forest may have been cleared in the past for agriculture, maybe just cleared for harvesting and left to, to regrow without professional management. Or it might have been a industrial timberland and had professional management and more of a monoculture of a pine tree or whatnot. So all those situations, the land use history really affects the carbon situation in the present. I talked about soil carbon and the importance of it. So certainly scale is important. And I said at a national scale, we're fairly certain about our current carbon status, but that uncertainty diminishes as our scale shrinks. And I showed you that figure with county level estimates, and some of those counties are highly uncertain estimates, plus or minus a couple 100% probably. So whereas at the national scale, we're fairly certain. So it's about how much effort you want to invest in monitoring and the science. And I think laser scanning and some emerging technologies really hold promise for refining and reducing our uncertainty of carbon estimates at the local scale. So it's kind of like stay tuned to that science. But that does increase your level of monitoring investment, whether you're even using laser scanning or drone technologies. You're still going to have to put more effort into determining your carbon at a local level. And certainly when it comes to soil carbon, there's not been a easy way to identify, to estimate soil carbon yet these days. It takes typically digging down to identify and do lab analysis of soils. So regional variations in flux, just to give you a little bit more understanding. Two contrasting environments, a northern hardwood forest versus a southern pine forest. As I mentioned, really the flux can really depend on variation in your stand growth, your soil attributes, your products industry that's associated with that certain system and climate. So you look at a southern pine forest, you're often talking very short rotations, industrially managed, really fast growth, but actually at the same time fast dead wood decay and litter decay. So those kind of combine for fast turnover. And there's theories out there that if things really warm up at higher latitudes, we can expect the same ecosystem processes at higher latitudes. So fast growth, fast death, fast emissions, and maybe fast sequestration. So it kind of changes the forest dynamics. You look at a northern hardwood forest, in contrast, for industrial management, longer rotations. It takes longer for forests to mature. But at the same time, you have a lot of accumulation of carbon and dead wood in the soils, which can remain for long periods of time. So if things warm up, things speed up as far as forest turnover, then you'd expect these dynamics to change. And should mention if there's, before I summarize things here, if there's any kind of final questions you have for me, to get them into the chat box for Penny to manage here. So as I kind of wrap things up here a little bit, so any final questions, please get them my way that I can take them. So in summary, at the national level, the U.S. uses an international accounting protocol, an international basis for carbon accounting. And our carbon accounting is largely based on our national inventory program. So the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program, FIA is for short. If you want more information about that program, you can just Google FIA, forest inventory analysis. Either way, you can probably bring up a whole library of information about how we conduct the inventory and all our techniques, protocols, quality assurance information, etc. This is in contrast to other nations who do not have a forest inventory, can't afford one. They're using remotely sensed imagery and modeling it as best they can. Sometimes just knowing the change in forest area is very impactful for setting policy in some areas. The forest carbon stocks across the U.S. are relatively large. All the forest, I did a calculation a couple years ago that all the forest carbon, all the carbon currently residing in U.S. forests is roughly equivalent to 100 years of fossil fuel emissions at our current rate of emission in the U.S. So a tremendous amount of carbon. In fact, if we lost all our forest carbon, it would really negate any and all emission reduction work we would hope to achieve for a number of generations. So it's really important in terms of the carbon balance of the U.S. and certainly the world, of course. Change is important. That's why I've been talking about change. That's what everybody wants to know about, and it's very difficult to measure for some pools, such as soil carbon. So total uncertainty can be tremendous at small scales for these difficult pools, and we can be fairly certain at larger scales with pools such as standing live trees. So, as far as the future goes, I believe we can expect increasing focus in the need for tree and forest carbon estimates across various scales, regardless of policies, etc. I think people recognize the increasing need for this information. So I won't be able to probably take all your questions today, but I've got an email address here, and that's the best way to get a hold of me. If I'm not in the office working with forest data, I'm in the woods collecting it, coordinating it, and away from my desk. So the best way to get a hold of me is often via my email, and there it is on the screen there. But I'll be happy to take any questions that you have. So thanks for your attention.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. We have several questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can. The first question is about the difference in rate. You talked about inventorying saplings and mature trees. Can you give us some idea about what the different carbon sequestration rates are with young trees versus veteran trees?
Yeah, yep. That's a, I wouldn't say it's a contentious area of research, but I'll kind of lay out the kind of, I guess, arguments that are hypotheses that are out there, right? So really mature large trees really can sequester a lot of carbon, right? Because they have very large boles, so each little bit of annual growth you put around that large bowl really accrues a lot of carbon. And at the same time, even in these mature forests, you have death, branch fall, and you have a lot of down dead wood, which is leaching, decaying, part of it decaying into the soil. So you have potential for a lot of carbon accretion in those systems. At the same time, but there's those older systems, though. I mean, they're starting to slow a little bit in their growth, but they're still putting a lot of growth on a large increment. In contrast, younger forests that have many more but smaller trees they're young and they're really growing fast, right? Faster than an older tree would. But at the same time, they're not having large down dead wood pools. They don't have a lot of large boles to put large increment on, and they're not necessarily transferring a lot of carbon to the soil. So you have those kind of two dynamics between kind of smaller, younger, rapidly growing forests versus more mature, older forests. Some people are doing kind of research at the landscape scale and various scenario testing. I know there's been some good research in some of my colleagues in Canada on this. Have kind of found that kind of a portfolio across the landscape, a diversity of stand conditions is optimal. So you have younger forests that you might be harvesting and have a vibrant long-lived forest products economy associated with it. At the same time, you have wilderness areas and parks where you have mature old-growth forests accruing carbon. And then also having that diverse mixture across the landscape, not only for carbon, but for wildlife and different species that need different stages of stand development is an optimal mix. So, like I said, the research is still ongoing. There's hypotheses about that, but that's kind of the difference in carbon accrual between kind of smaller young forests and older mature forests.
Okay. There are several questions about funding for the U.S. Forest Service. Is your organization maintaining stable funding, or is your funding changing with the current political climate?
That's a good question. Obviously, as a current federal employee, I can't comment too much, but I can relay what is basic public information. And that I think is relayed in a few nonprofit reports on the matter of Forest Service R&D. So the Forest Service R&D budget itself has declined annually, inflation adjusted. Has declined annually every year since 2010. So we've been on a kind of a long-term decline now, and I believe we're down compared to 2010 inflation adjusted. We're probably down by about a quarter to a third of what we had 8 years ago. So it's been a steady decline.
All right, thank you. How do unchecked invasive plant species affect carbon sequestration levels?
That's a good question, and that's why I use the term global change more often than climate change. I'm not denying climate change. I would say I'm a climate change scientist. Being that, I think we can't overlook invasive species and browse, insects and disease that are really affecting our forests, our ability to manage healthy, resilient, adaptable forests that can continue to sequester carbon into the future. So the problem with invasive species is that it can really reduce your species diversity. So, we're expecting change in the future. And when you expect change, you want to have like a whole suite of species to choose from to help you out, like a diverse toolbox. And so when an invasive species comes in and kind of just takes over the understory or displaces a lot of native vegetation, it really reduces your ability to respond to future change. I've been working, I had the opportunity to work with New York City Parks to go on a tour of some of their locations in urban areas, talking about adaptive management for the future and providing ecosystem services like carbon sequestration. And you go in some of these areas, they're so invaded with invasive species, you don't even know where to start. It's like hardly in a forest anymore. It's like, a vineland. They call them vinelands. So it's that's a real extreme example, but it really, I think it's a really important topic, and in the certain situations can really, the presence of invasive species really affect your ability to sequester carbon, because really a growing forest is with a diversity of species is really resilient and adaptable to the future in terms of carbon sequestration.
All right. Is there any research with recommendations on how to improve below ground sequestration?
I have not studied that in particular. It's like I said, there's a lot of uncertainty in regards to that. Really, the below ground, there's a lot of emerging science regarding the fungal and microbial communities associated with below ground roots, etc. I mean, it's really emerging. I invite people to kind of read it. Read into that literature. It's only been coming out in the past like 2 to 3 years. So people are finding those unique communities associated with these kind of root systems, as you would expect, both fungal and microbial, which are determining like soil carbon levels, etc. And I don't think we've quite gotten to the point to understanding how our management of the forest above necessarily affects all that. I mean, it's probably fundamental things, but I don't have an easy answer on that one. That's really an emerging topic and a very good question, because I think we're finding some emerging relationships there between the type of tree species, and maybe how they're managed, and the associated communities below ground that are sequestering carbon. You know, like, well, most of carbon is like microbial communities. You know, that's what that organic material is, and so you would appreciate it's dynamic and associated with the living trees, hence the root system that interfaces in the soil. So, very good question.
Thank you. Is there any research group that you could recommend for our audience that would provide information specific to landscape level, residential scale, or larger for what the landscape community can be doing to positively affect carbon?
Yeah. You know, I have one that comes to mind, and probably because I'm affiliated with that group, so I know there's some good people on that staff. It's called NIACS. I think the National Institute of Applied Carbon Science. So if you type in the acronym NIACS, it's associated with the U.S. Forest Service. They have climate change adaptation guides that help land managers step through questions and whatnot as far as how they can adapt to the future and still sequester carbon, etc. And they have they have some good point of contacts on their website, so you could probably email them your questions on that, and that's kind of a really good kind of extension type thing that they work on. So I'd kind of point you in their direction, because I know they work with communities and have done so many workshops, definitely with foresters, but I know they're starting to branch into urban areas now, and I think they're trying to coordinate some of this work. I might be beginning with New York City parks in the Baltimore area, in Minneapolis. There's actually a lot of cities starting to get interested in some of the stuff we're just have been doing now in rural forests for the past few years when it comes to sequestering carbon and climate adaptation, etc.
Okay, thank you. We have a few questions relating to fossil fuel emissions. Is there any carbon sequestration data being correlated with the increased carbon emissions from burning fossil fuels? And we had at least a couple of comments about talking about carbon sequestration without showing the carbon emissions seems to be a little misleading.
Yeah. So I think I had the one figure there at the beginning with the net emissions in the U.S. from fossil fuels. That was like the black line, which is like, as you know, it's like 8 times more than forests are sequestering. So, yeah, in some of my talks might go in a little bit more detail. I obviously in the past I'm not a fossil fuel sector analyst. So, but as I said, like roughly 12% is offset. That means there's a lot still being emitted. So I'm not quite sure what the question's getting at in particular, but so that I believe I addressed that part. But there's also potential for CO2 enrichment. So if you're talking about correlation between like fossil fuel emissions and forest growth, some have postulated that, and well, it's proven in lab experiments that a more CO2 enriched atmosphere certainly can help forest growth. But there's a lot of caveats there. If there's droughts, episodic disturbances, like I said, all these global change events may negate any positive effect from CO2 enrichment. So So people have tried to kind of correlate CO2 enrichment with forest growth at any kind of scale, like you'd see at a region or national scale, and they haven't been able to do that. There's a lot of confounding factors with that too. So, but I don't know if that question was getting to CO2 enrichment, but.
Okay. Regarding the future scenarios slide that you showed earlier, the question is, are you saying that 2 out of 3 climate change emission scenarios that the U.S. is going to be negative carbon emitting? Or is that taking into account all of our carbon emissions nationally? Or are you just talking about certain kinds of emissions?
That was good. Yep. Thanks for the clarifying question. Yeah, that was just for forest carbon. What's the status of forest carbon in the future? So yeah, out of 2 out of 3 there, definitely look like by around 2030 to 2040 that U.S. forest would be a net emitter of carbon. And they did use climate change scenarios, but that wasn't that influential. Really, the land use change. Like if there's much more suburban development and you lose forests, then yeah, you're going to start to that's a huge driver. That's going to be probably determining the future. Is like land use, what we do with our land. Certainly, more droughts and wildfires can have an effect, but those are harder to model with the climate change scenarios, I believe. So I think there's probably high uncertainty with that. But yeah, those scenarios showed a high likelihood of net emissions within a generation or two from U.S. forests due to probably land use change.
Okay. Also, in terms of land use, conversion to agricultural use seems to reduce carbon greatly by the loss of above ground forest. How is that any worse than loss to growing development?
I don't think that's any worse. As far as I'm not putting a value judgment on that. With ag areas, I mean, I guess there's a potential for that to one day, revert back to forest, as we have seen in the past. Less so for urban areas. Typically, when it is converted to a suburban area, urban, it doesn't revert back to forest. I mean, I guess there's some cases of it happening, but that's not typically the dynamic. Once a forest is converted to a development, it usually doesn't revert back to a forest. So, like I said, the big question for those land, like agricultural and urban, is what happens to the soil carbon, because that's the biggest carbon pool, and long-term trajectories of formerly forest soil carbon in these other land uses is an important determinant of carbon being emitted from those land uses. That's excluding fossil fuels. Like I said, that was just the terrestrial emission. I wasn't looking at fossil fuels or anything like that.
Okay, we are running out of time, so we're just going to finish up with one last question. Can you talk just a little bit about how different composition of a forest in terms of types of species or age of the forest, how does that change the capacity for sequestration?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for all the good questions. It sounds like we had some lively debate for a little while on this, which is good. It's good to kind of keep this topic out front. And this relating to this question, I touched on it a little bit earlier with the question about kind of smaller trees versus larger trees. And like I said, there's hypotheses out there right now, and certainly if you had a forest products industry, long-lived wood products, and well-managed forest, keeping the forest as forest, that can contribute positively to the forest carbon sequestration. But likewise, also having, I believe, like a diverse forest with a variety of tree species that can handle various situations, because we do not know what's going to happen exactly in the future. With you know, various ages of trees, so you have regeneration in there. So you're really talking like a mixed species forest with a younger cohort of trees. Can really give you a lot of options for the future in regards to management, or just an unmanaged condition. You know, just letting it just you know, accrue carbon naturally. It doesn't have to be managed. So like I said, the most when people ask me what's the most important thing, and that's keeping forest as forest. We've seen it in the past with the trajectories of carbon in the past. That's the easiest decision, is whether to keep it as forest or not. And keeping it as forest, even if it is going to be industrially managed or whatnot, it's still hopefully remaining forest. And you know, long-lived forest products, such as, you know, tall buildings made of wood, et cetera, as opposed to concrete or steel, which are tremendous CO2 emitters, you know, is maybe a path forward. But that's why I believe keeping forest as forest in terms of the forest carbon trajectories is probably the most important thing that can be done. So.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Woodall, for sharing all of this valuable information and research. It certainly has given us a lot to think about. So thank you, and good day to you all.